Welcome back. Today we are going to be learning about the Vray material shader. If you want to learn how to create photorealistic renders in Maya, it is very important that you learn how to create photorealistic materials first. Let's clean up our UI a bit before we get started. We're going to get rid of the time slider and the range slider because we won't be using them. We aren't really animating anything and it just takes up screen space. Go to Windows and look for UI elements. Click on the plenty dots above the status line option. This detaches the pop-up so we can select or unselect multiple elements at once. Disable the range and time sliders to take them off the screen. You can disable any of the others provided you are not using them, but I'm going to be using all of the others, so I'll leave them on. Before we get started on materials, let me introduce you to the Hypershade. This button here, when clicked, opens up a new window called the Hypershade. So immediately we see a new set of windows that perform whole new functions. But don't be overwhelmed, we'll tackle them individually. In the browser window, you can navigate through rendering assets like your materials, textures, lights, cameras, and many more. The Create window allows you to create different material types and rendering assets. You'll find the various Vray material types in this tab if you have already loaded Vray into the scene. See this video if you haven't already done that. This is a graph editor, which shows the graph networks of the selected object or material. Right-click and hold on Lambert 1. Drag the cursor to graph network and release it. We see that Lambert 1 graph network pops up on the graph editor, and we can see all the different assets that are connected to Lambert 1. Click this icon to clear the graph editor. On the top right corner, we have a material viewer. Here we have a preview of any material we create. Right now, Lambert 1 is selected, so this is a preview of Lambert 1 on Maya hardware. Let's change it to Vray, and now this is how Lambert 1 would look like if you rendered it in Vray. You can change the preview object into anything you want. A sphere, a piece of cloth, and that's pretty. Anyway, I like to keep mine shadable. You can also change the background to any one of the presets to get a better feel of how your material will look like in different environments. Mess around with this, it's up to you. The property editor is like an attribute editor for the Hypershade. In fact, the first icon allows you to adopt the format of the attribute editor in here, which I recommend turning on. The second icon allows you to tear off the panel and move it around whenever needed. Now that we are done with the introduction, let's dive into the Vray material. Let's create a sphere. By now you should know how to. I'll still leave visual prompts on the video, but as we progress and get better, I'm going to start taking off the training wheels. If you are new to this channel, however, and are a bit confused, consider watching my previous videos where I brush up on the basics of Maya. Also, subscribe if you enjoyed the video and want more content like this. Let's create a plane from the sphere and scale it up. Create a dome light for the sphere so we get that soft environmental lighting. Open up the attribute editor like we did in the last video. Enable use dome texture and assign your chosen HDR image. Again, I've linked below sites where you can get these images and my very own HDR image. Now, I actually want to see how this HDR image looks in a render, so I'm going to use something called the IPR, which is short for Interactive Progressive Render. It's Vray's version of a real-time render engine. It allows you to see any material changes in real time. It of course uses your GPU for this task, so it helps when you have a dedicated GPU with a lot of VRAM. I use a 1050 Ti with 4 gigs of RAM, so you can estimate how fast or slow your IPR will be relative to mine. I don't know if it works with AMD GPUs though. Know that if for some reason your rig can't support IPR, the material viewer in the Hypershade is an alternative for previewing materials. Clicking on this icon will activate the IPR. We see that any changes we make in our scene reflects immediately in the IPR. We can pause the IPR by clicking on this button. Clicking the stop icon stops the IPR. You can also do a render region in the IPR where Vray updates only a specific section of your scene in real time. Let's stop the IPR, disable the region render and start up another IPR. Clicking the light bulb icon brings up the light lister, which shows all the lights we have in our scene. As you can see, the dome light is the only light we have in here. Let's disable the dome light and immediately we can see that our scene renders out black. This is just because there are no lights in the scene. Enabling the dome light immediately lights up the scene. Now let's apply a Vray material to the sphere. There are a number of ways to apply a Vray material to objects, and I'm going to teach you 3 of them today. First, select the object you want to apply the material to. Head over to the Vray shelf and click this icon to apply the material. We don't really see any change in the viewport, but down in the command line we see a message that tells us that a new Vray material has been assigned to the selected object. With the sphere still selected, go to the attribute editor, navigate to Vray material and give it a new name. I'm going to name it Sphere MTL. The second way to create a material is by opening the Hypershade. In the Create tab, simply click on Vray MTL and a new Vray material shader will be created. We can see this new material in the graph editor. I'm naming it Plain MTL. Now, we don't want to keep minimizing to see our viewport, so we can actually create a viewport panel in our Hypershade window. Go to Window and click on Viewport to bring up the viewport panel. We can dock it right here so it will be more convenient for us. The third way to assign a Vray material is by right-clicking and holding on an object, going to Assign Vray material and choosing a new material to assign. Let's take a closer look at our Sphere MTL. This icon here is a swatch. Under the swatch properties, you can specify whether you want your swatch to auto-update itself or update only when clicked. I always enable auto updates, but if you want a slight performance boost, you can disable this option. Under basic parameters, our first property is the diffuse color, which basically means whatever color we want our object to be. So if we change the diffuse color to red, the object becomes red. The next value is amount, which I always keep at 1. You can tweak it if you want for stylistic purposes, but 1 is a more realistic value. I'm also going to make my red a little less saturated. The next value is opacity, which deals with the visibility of your material. Black means totally invisible and white means totally visible. Let's start an IPR to see how this effect will look when rendered. Alright, the red looks nice here. Now let's tweak the opacity effect. The sphere completely vanishes, leaving behind just a shadow. You can disable the shadows cast for the sphere, but at that point it will be no different than hiding the objects. You can also simulate cutouts by attaching a texture to the opacity map. Let's attach this black and white checkered image and see its effects. We see that Vray has cut out all the black squares and left all the white ones. This can be a pretty cool effect if you use it right. Okay, let's go back to the Hypershade and get rid of the opacity map. Right click and select Graph Network. Delete the texture and placement nodes and change the opacity back to white. The next value is the roughness amount, which deals with how the material handles reflections. Is it going to reflect as a rough or smooth material? Generally, larger values give flatter reflections. This value really depends on which material you are trying to emulate. Let's move on to the reflection section. Reflection color specifies how much you want your object to reflect, while reflection glossiness specifies how glossy or shiny you want these reflections to be. Lower values produce matte materials, while higher values produce glossy materials. Again, I normally leave the amount at 1, which is the more realistic value. You can tweak it if you want something more stylized, however. Let's see how the reflection controls affect the material in real time. Alright, we see that the sphere has now started to reflect the environment around it. The more we increase the glossiness, the more distinct those reflections become. You can play around with your reflections, but I'm going to leave mine at these values. Metalness lets you specify whether your material is a metal or not. 0 means not a metal and 1 means it's a metal. Anything in between is for stylistic purposes. Increasing the metalness to 1 gives our sphere a distinct metallic sheen. Increasing the glossiness alongside the metalness makes the sphere very reflective. Turn the metalness back to 0. Under the refraction section, we have the refraction color, which deals with how much light we want passing through our object. White means a lot of light, and black means no light at all. This is normally used to create refractive materials like glass and water. Making the refractive color white turns our sphere transparent. You can see the plane and surrounding environment through the sphere. Of course, the default refractive index is 1.6, so we have some distortions. Let's hide the plane by selecting it and hitting H on the keyboard so we can see this more clearly. Let's change the refractive index to 0. Change all the reflective values to default and the sphere completely disappears. Let's change the IOR to 1 and we see that there is still no sphere because 1 is the refractive index of air. We have basically created an air material. Let's change the IOR to 1.3333, which is the refractive index of water, and the sphere comes back with its distorted refractions. An IOR of 1.6 is the default IOR, and also the IOR for glass. We're going to leave it at that. The refraction glossiness controls the clearness of your refractions. Lower values give you blurred refractions and take a while to render. I normally use lower values for a frosted glass effect. I want to bring back my plane, so I'm going to open the outliner, select the plane and press H to unhide it. Let's go back to the attribute editor and play with the forecolor. I normally like to put the color of my refractive material here instead of diffuse or refraction color. I feel like the forecolor just gives the most realistic effect when it comes to refractive materials. Affect shadow specifies whether you want the refractive values to affect the shadows cast by the object. Next is bump and normal mapping. This is where you assign textures to specify the relief of a material. It basically adds realism and depth to your textures. Bump maps normally come in grayscale and contain information that specify the height of textures. Click on the checker box beside the map and assign the map that I have linked in the description, or any bump map of your choice. Immediately, we see that our sphere has taken on the texture of the bump map. You can control the intensity of this effect with the bump multiplier. The closer to 0, the less the effect. This is the same process we use to assign normal maps. Just one more thing before the video ends. Let's make our plane look like a metal sheet. Select the plane. In the attribute editor, we see that it still has Lambert 1 applied because we never really changed its material. So head over to Hypershade, right click on plane material and hold, and hover on assign material to selected objects, and release the cursor over assign material to selected objects. This assigns plane MTL to the selected plane. Let's make the diffuse color dark gray and increase the reflection and metalness to their highest values. Now we have a very reflective sheet of metal. I don't want that, so I'm going to reduce the reflection color and reflection glossiness. And now we see that the sheet doesn't really look all that metallic. I'm going to keep tweaking these two values until I find a balance between them. And there, my metal sheet now looks right. I just wanted to do this to show you that there is no hard fast rule to creating materials. As long as you understand what each property does, you'll be able to create any material of your choice without having to memorize arbitrary values. That's it for today's video. If you learned something from this video, subscribe and hit the like button. If not, give me your suggestions in the comment section. I'm all ears. I have nothing to do after all. Anyway, in the next video, we'll learn how to make more materials like wood and ceramic. So subscribe to stay tuned, or don't, your choice, or is it really?